Hello, I'm Jim Hancock, political editor of Downtown in Business, standing in for Frank McKenna, who's slapping on the sun cream in Greece. I'm joined by the wonderful Jo Phillips, broadcaster, podcaster, and former comms chief for Paddy Ashdown, who was the last action man leader of the Lib Dems before Sir Ed Davey. We'll be discussing the latest very dramatic developments in the race for the White House, the first row of the new Labour government over the two-child benefit issue, the weighty King's speech in general, and will the Tories go long or short in their leadership race?
Just the all bigoted women.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
Well, Jo, get your first reaction to this momentous decision. I think both of us are old enough to remember Lyndon Johnson in 1968 saying, "I will not seek, nor will I accept the nomination of my party because of the Vietnam War." And then there was a slightly lower key decision not to go for an extra term by Truman in 1952, which I'm relieved to say I was too young to remember. So we really are in fairly historic times.
Yes, we are. I think if I was in Trump's camp, I would think, oh, damn, that's blown a hole in it. I mean, it was getting to the point with Joe Biden where it was actually sad. And I think I've said this before. It's like, you've got to take the car keys away because he was not in a position. And he's done the right thing. I think it had got to the point where the damage to America, to the American democratic system and to the rest of the world was so shocking if he had stayed and lost. And I think, we'll have to wait and see what happens. But it does seem that people are rallying around Kamala Harris. And I think she would be, although, to us on this side of the Atlantic, she's relatively unknown. I think she would be quite a formidable opponent to Trump, who is a misogynist, who is a convicted sex offender, whose attitude to women is appalling. And I think there are some really important issues that might galvanize Black Americans and women around a Kamala Harris against Trump.
You don't think she's not distanced enough from Trump? There are arguments saying that there should be a complete change of direction, that she's too associated with the Biden presidency.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there has been some disappointment, as far as I can tell, that she has not been terribly visible as a vice president. But, who knows? You and I don't have the sort of the inner workings of the White House like we do about, Downtown in Business, where obviously that is like the White House, but in a slightly different scale.
Well, it has a fairly elderly leader, I think. That would be
Are you trying to do yourself out of a regular podcast, Jim? The suntan lotion will have slipped at that point. He might have spilled his pina colada all over the suntan lotion.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think, the fact that the Trump campaign has now gone on to this ludicrous attack of, well, if Joe Biden's not fit to stand for re-election, he shouldn't be a president. We need him to stand down now. That's absolutely bonkers. He's just said he's not going to stand for re-election. That doesn't stop him being president for the remaining, less than 6 months, in fact.
Well, some Republicans, I think the Vance, the vice presidential candidate on the Trump ticket, thinks that he, if he's not fit to be standing for the next 4 years, how can we be sure that he's capable of doing it for the next till January?
Well, yes, but then the argument is actually it turns on its head because you go, well, he's got an extremely good vice president and watch out, she's coming for you. Just because you decide not to run doesn't mean that you are not capable of, lasting out the last few months of your presidency.
Do you think, there is an argument that he took too long about this because we are right up against the deadline. There's a very complicated issue, which I won't go into in great detail, about Ohio, which apparently needs to know who's going to be on the ticket by early August. They've changed it to September the 1st, but that law doesn't come until the end of August. So unless they're careful, they won't be able to have a Democratic candidate in Ohio. So the whole thing is going to be fairly compressed. And Biden could have avoided this by acknowledging his health problems, at the very least, immediately after the debate. But according to the Republicans, they think that Kamala Harris has known about this for months on end, and really they're almost saying that Biden should have not entered the primary race at all in the first place.
Well, I should imagine there are some Democrats who feel that as well, Jim. And I think, the Democrats are at fault. When Biden was elected last time round, they should have been lining up the next successor because, he was an elderly man. He is an elderly man. None of us are getting any younger. And they should have been grooming or looking at who could be the next person. Now, whether that's Kamala Harris or whether that was Kamala Harris then, who knows? But they've left it. All of them have left it to the last minute. And I think he'd got to the point, in fact, just before the news broke last night, I was talking to a friend of mine and I said, it's got to the point now where he's being selfish and stubborn. This is not about him. And there has to be a greater recognition that this is more important and he can go out with dignity and a very distinguished political career. But I think, the near assassination attempt on Trump, the almost messianic way he was received at that convention, the selection of J.D. Vance as his running mate, and that sort of fervor of the Trump fanatics is quite frightening to see. And there does need to be something on offer for people who don't want that.
Yes, it's interesting you should raise the tone of Joe Biden, former President Trump, because immediately after the assassination attempt, which we all condemned, was absolutely dreadful, there were indications that he was going to tone it down. And indeed, his demeanor, to some extent, during the Republican convention was more low-key. But hey, presto, as soon as Biden announces his decision, we had a really vicious sort of riposte from Trump saying Biden never been fit for office and Kamala Harris had known about all this. So it seems as if it's business as usual now as far as the Republican campaign is concerned.
Yeah, he turned up and said, I'm going to be here. I want to talk about unity. I think that lasted for about 30 seconds. And then he went on. And I think, whoever the Democrats choose, it is going to illustrate the nonsense of Donald Trump, who we've seen Joe Biden be incoherent and stumbly and get President Zelensky muddled up with President Putin. But, here's a man who talks about Hannibal Lecter as though he is a real person that he is personally friends with. So I think, it will actually make him look even more unhinged than some of us already think he is.
Just to slightly push back on that, in terms of this international affairs and the fears that we have about Trump's presidency, it was put to me last week that because he's so unpredictable, there may be something in what he says about that Putin wouldn't have dared to go into Ukraine and Hamas wouldn't have dared to do what they want to do because they don't quite know what the reaction of this person is going to be. Do you give that any merit at all?
Not really. Who knows what the real relationship between Donald Trump wants it to be about him. If he thought he could do a deal with Putin and Ukraine, he would, because it's about him. But he's got no wider vision of what Ukraine would have to give up or whether he could trust Putin. And I don't think he would have prevented the Hamas attack. There are huge arguments and questions over the fact that America didn't have a proper Middle East base security detail monitoring that area. They were all elsewhere. And Hamas had obviously chosen a moment when everybody was looking the other way. So I don't think he would have stopped that. No, I don't give that any credence, Jim, because I think in the end, if the only thing that keeps the world from blowing up is two very unpredictable lunatics, Putin and Trump, then we're in a pretty sorry state.
Well, it's as far as we can tell now, when the Democrats sort out their ticket, it's going to be a very close race. That there's like 90% of the voters in America are absolutely irrevocably committed to one candidate or the other, and it's going to come down to a few thousand votes in a few key states in the autumn. Just sort of looking at this historically, we're talking about the conventions. Of course, I'm reliably told that the convention system has really changed. In 1952, for instance, Dwight Eisenhower went to the Republican convention with two other candidates, and he was chosen after a series of ballots. And historically, there was none of this primary business. You arrived at the convention, you heard the speeches, and you made the choice. I suppose in this day and age of wanting sort of certainty well in advance, that that would be a bad thing. But I mean, would an open convention by the Democrats, with all the publicity it would achieve and the profile that two or three candidates, Harris battling against Newsom or Gretchen Whitmer or something like that, would that be the end of the world for the Democrats? Would it just be portrayed as them in a state of turmoil, or would it be a magnificent exercise in democracy?
Well, it would be a magnificent exercise in democracy if it had happened a year ago. But I think, this close, with the pressures, as you say, on, whatever legislation in various states allows the names to be on the ballot paper and all the rest of it, and the very complex system of American elections anyway, I think, you can't do that now, because you're then saying, okay, this all hinges on one speech or one performance. And I think time is too tight, and I think the stakes are too high.
Right. Well, I think we'll turn to domestic politics now, and the first row of the new Labour government, and that's over this two-child benefit cap, and an amendment being put down by a Liverpool MP, Labour MP, if it's called by the Speaker. And I would actually think it's a test of Lindsay Hoyle that he must allow it, because it's become a matter of considerable interest. I guess the origins of this were lurid Daily Mail depictions of super dad, a chap on benefits with 20 children, which is, of course, at the extreme end of this, and the introduction of this two-child benefit cap. But it's certainly making the headlines and testing Labour's commitment to ending child poverty, isn't it?
Yes, and one of the most consistent and articulate spokespeople in the campaign against child poverty is Gordon Brown, of course. And I think, although at a sort of some level you can see, hang on a minute, why should taxpayers be paying benefits to people who are just continuing to have children when they're on benefits? But of course, the people who really suffer are the children. And that can't possibly be right. So it's a difficult one, and you're absolutely right. I mean, do you remember that ghastly Channel 4 programme called Benefit Street, where we had this sort of poverty porn? We were invited to look at how people lounged around in front of, 39-mile wide TV screens, never lifting a finger, living in squalor and sponging off the rest of us. I mean, that mercifully has gone out of the window. And I think anybody who works with or is on benefits knows perfectly well that it is not a particularly cushy life, and you have to go through lots of hoops to get them. But it's a tough call. Labour has set its store by fiscal responsibility, and we've already seen over the weekend this report coming out recommending an above inflation pay increase to public sector workers. Now, Rachel Reeves, the new Chancellor, would be bonkers if she doesn't accept that. And she's already said that the long-term costs of retention and recruitment in those desperately needed jobs in the health service, in teaching, and other areas of the public sector, never mind further industrial action. So, you've got to weigh that up against suddenly having to find an extra £8 billion if she's going to meet that. Well, that's got to come from somewhere. And similarly, if you sort of say, well, okay, we'll lift the child benefit cap, then what happens? Do you then have hundreds of thousands more people on benefits with more children. And we know that, people living on benefits, children who are eligible for free school meals, struggle further and harder than other parts of the population. I mean, there are ways, I would imagine, and I would imagine that, all the members of the cabinet are looking at how you do this, whether they reintroduce something like Sure Start, whether they reintroduce things like free school breakfast. They've already said that for primary schools, but if they had free school meals for every child, if they looked at rent caps, for instance, there are other ways to help people, and there are other ways to help families with children who are in poverty without just, signing a blank check, if you like. But it's a terrible conundrum, and it is a schism within the Labour Party. Not a huge one, but it is an indication, I think, of there will be problems to come, and we're only a couple of weeks in.
Yes, I want to come back to the wider implications of the public sector pay settlement, but just to finish off on this child benefit. So I think we've identified two problems here. One is the actual cost of it. It would punch another hole in Rachel's fiscal prudence. But, I think you've hinted at another concern. I mean, for instance, families who are not on benefits, who are contemplating whether to have a third child or not, could well look round and say, well, if you're on benefits, you get this, but, we have to take tough decisions about whether to have a third child without the support of the state. So do you think there's an element of that in the Labour Party, thinking it's not as widely popular? It might be popular amongst the, obviously the left and people like that and charity groups, but in the wider public, there's not the support for ending the two-child cap.
No, I think you're probably right. And I think, although there is the heart tells you we want to stop child poverty, the head is also telling you, hang on a minute, as you rightly say, Jim, people are having to make decisions about whether they stay in rented accommodation. And if you have a bigger family and you are not a homeowner, then you are going to find it harder to find somewhere to live, to rent. Are you then going to put you and your family onto a housing waiting list that could be years, or could mean that you're living in very, very substandard accommodation? So I think, there are lots and lots of very tough decisions. And it needs to be a grown-up conversation, which is one where we say, yes, we don't want children growing up or being born into poverty, but there has to be something else, and there has to be a way of either helping those families, back into work, or using other mechanisms to support them in what is a very difficult time.
Yes, just to finally say that there was the new MP for Fylde in Lancashire, Andrew Snowden, was on their regional political programme at the weekend, and I was quite impressed with him. I didn't know him at all. He's about one of only two Tory MPs in the Northwest, and he was, saying he didn't agree with abolishing the two-child limit, and and from his point of view, he's been quite brave about it. So I think he's a person to note for the future. But the other MP, of course, in the Northwest who's involved in this is Kim Johnson, the Liverpool Riverside MP, and she's been quite careful. She's picking up on what you've just said, that she doesn't want to talk of rebellion and things. This is part of a debate. And so I think you're right to say, let's not leap into the sort of, because obviously the Mail and people like that are immediately looking forward to, splits and things in the Labour Party. But I don't think that's happening at the moment. Perhaps we'll take a quick break now, and then we'll come back and look at other things that you want to raise, Jo, about what was a very full King's speech. King Charles was kept on the throne for even longer than normal in order to announce all these things. So we'll be discussing that after the break, along with the latest stage in the travails of the Conservative Party as they try and decide on how they're going to choose a new leader. Welcome back to this podcast where we haven't got Frank McKenna, who's on holiday, a well-deserved break. But I am joined by Jo Phillips, former comms chief for Paddy Ashdown and now a broadcaster on a number of channels, including Times Radio and GB News. Jo, let's turn to we've discussed the two-child benefit, but there was an awful lot more in the King's speech. What were the key features for you?
Planning is the big one, and I think that's the one that they're going to have to work very hard at. The Sunday Telegraph a couple of weeks ago did this ridiculous thing about how hypocritical it was of Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner and Yvette Cooper and David Lammy, and they'd all campaigned in their constituents against housing, and here was Labour trying to push through this, building on green belts, forget that park, etc., etc. It's going to be a housing estate. And again, it goes back to this thing, Jim, which is about having a sensible grown-up conversation. And in fact, I was on 5 Live talking about it and said, well, if you read this document, you will see that actually they'd opposed various planning things because they were not suitable. And in most cases, they were either thrown out, they were abandoned, or they were deemed to be unlawful, or changes were made. I think, the whole thing about housing and the whole thing about planning could be so transformative to this country, because there is a housing shortage. But what we've got is this piecemeal nonsense of development. So you'll get, a developer who's bought a plot of land, sat on it for several years, and then suddenly is going to build, 300 executive homes. Oh, and maybe one affordable. And a community centre and an access road, or something like that. Then you get another one somewhere else, which is sort of like, oh, let's do 500 houses here. No, there isn't any more primary school places. No, there's no more public transport. There's no extra dentists or doctors. And that's why people get concerned and fed up, that there is no sensible organisation. And I've long believed from the years when I worked with local authorities that if you could do better building within town centres, particularly where so many of them have seen retail just gone, you would actually regenerate town centres, because people would walk about more, they would shop locally. That would help smaller local businesses, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers, etc., etc. And you would actually have much more vibrant town and city centres. And the other thing we're not looking at, but Angela Rayner has mentioned it, is, building houses where you're going up the sort of the old Edwardian Victorian type terraces, where you've got more space, instead of building these boxes, not very often well built, that require cars, and everybody's got 2 cars, if not more. And then you end up with clogged up traffic and things. So I think that's going to be a huge battle. But if they get it right, it could be absolutely transformative. And if they can persuade people and local authorities and local communities that when they talk about the green belt, they're not talking about, parks and gardens and woodland and stuff like that. They're looking at places by the side of railway lines. They're looking at places along motorways, and all of that stuff. I think what they've got to do is they've got to move at speed, but they've got to, if you'll pardon the pun, not look as though they're bulldozing the concerns of local communities.
Yeah, I do wonder. I mean, I think the target is 1.5 million houses. And I do wonder whether there's enough grey spaces, these disused petrol station forecourts and the sort of things you're talking about alongside railway lines, to actually meet that. And whether you would not surely have to acknowledge that what they are talking about is the green belt. It's genuine green belt, which is going to have to be developed. And if that is the case, are we not going to see, because Labour's majority is so big, they now represent large chunks of rural England, not to mention the Liberal Democrats, who I believe you can now walk from North Devon to West London without soiling your feet in anything other than yellow territory, that there's going to be a pushback.
There will be, but I think it's about how they deal with local authorities. And I think it's also about giving local authorities the confidence to say to developers, right, there needs to be a change. Cash-strapped local authorities have been too willing too often, particularly outside the big metropolitan areas, to roll over for the promise of, here's the CGI, here's mum pushing a pushchair, here's a kid with a balloon, here's a little dog walking along, and look at this lovely grassy playing field area. And the reality is none of that. The reality is somewhere where people have to get in their cars to drive to school, to work, to the shops, etc. And there is no sense of community. So there is a lot to be said for the idea of, new towns. So places like Ebbsfleet, for instance, in North Kent, where we've got that fabulous Ebbsfleet International Station, which of course no international trains stop at, obviously, since Brexit. Similarly, Ashford International, it's a ghost town. It's a large car park and the trains just go zooming past. And people like me who live in Kent have to go up to London to get a train to go back past where we live to get across to France, or just go the old-fashioned way and jump on a ferry. So I think, if you give the councils the confidence and you put some pressure on developers and say, right, okay, we need the infrastructure first, then you can do the housing. Because there's an awful lot of wriggle room for developers and they can get away with the viability claims about affordable housing. Go, oh, we're really sorry. The cost of building's gone up, so now we can't afford to do those affordable homes. What a shame. Oh, we're not going to build a primary school, but we can have a community centre instead. So there's all of that stuff. And I think if the government backs local authorities, if they can recruit more planners, and the developers don't have the upper hand all the time, then I think, there will be some way to doing this. And actually getting local people to say, no, this is where we need X, Y, or Z, not here. So listen to people, engage with local MPs of all parties and local authorities. I think it's, it is so fundamental and it is so important. And we've got to stop this in absolute concentration around London and the southeast. And the other thing is, look at the transport hubs. If you've got good transport, then you can build. You can build around those transport hubs, and that makes a lot of sense. Whereas, building a random estate of 500 houses in the middle of the countryside where there is no public transport, what's the point?
I still think the very fact that greenfields are going to be built on is one of the biggest factors. I mean, I absolutely take on board what you're saying about, if there's infrastructures to support them, then it might gain more support. But I still think there's problems ahead, not least because, of course, all local authorities have developed at great expense local plans. And when the new Labour government comes along and says we want to do this or that, they're going to point to their local plans. I don't know what the future for those local plans are. Maybe they'll just be set aside in the national interest.
Well, I mean, there needs to be some sort of joined up thinking, because the local plan, it takes up months and months and months of work, and then it has to go out to consultation, and then it comes back, and it's painting the Forth Bridge. By the time it comes back, it's out of date from its first proposal. The government's changed, or in the case of the last government, the Prime Minister's changed 5 times, and the pressure's gone. So I think, if Labour can be sensible. And the other thing to say about this is, if you are looking at greenfields and you're looking at agricultural land, if they get it right on support with farmers and environmental areas of concern and issues, and there is one thing that I'm slightly concerned about, is that they're looking at this idea about water pollution, and I'm not talking about the water companies putting sewage into the rivers, but a lot of stuff that holds up building works is about the stuff that goes into rivers and water sources, and that causes delays, which is a problem. Now, nobody is for 1 minute suggesting that you should lift those, but the government is looking at it. So actually, if you're looking at that and you're looking at it in the round and you're saying, right, so every new house, it's going to cost you, the developer, a lot more, but it's going to have a double water system for grey water and clean water. Everything's going to be solar powered. Everything's going to have heat pumps. You're actually investing for the future. And I think, the government's ambitions are huge, and they are way beyond 1 term. They've made that very clear. And all of these things are going to take time. There's going to be fights. There's going to be problems. But if you can reassure farmers that we, the government, are supporting you to grow food because we need more food sustainability in this country, then it's less attractive to farmers to sell off chunks of land for development.
Another area which certainly has, downtown, we've already had some feedback from business, concerns this plan for workers' rights. Now, this is around issues like banning 0 hours contracts, full rights from the first day at work, more ability to work from home. And some businesses are saying, how is that compatible with the drive for growth? What are your feelings about that?
Well, I think it's, the devil is in the detail. And I've spoken to a few sort of small business owners, from restaurateurs to hairdressers and people, and they're saying, oh, this is going to kill us. And again, it goes back to the conversation about the child benefit cap. Nobody wants people to not be paid a decent wage. But if you're a small business, one chap I know who's got a small restaurant, it's going to cost him an extra £30,000 a year just to pay the extra to bring people up to the minimum wage level. I think the thing about rights to sick pay and rights to holiday pay and working from home are fine, but you've got to be able to have proper conversations with people, because you are still surely in a position where you say, right, Jim, I'm going to take you on as my youthful trainee, but I, as your employer, I'm still entitled to say to you, you haven't turned up for the last 3 days, or you've been at the wrong place, so we need to have a disciplinary, we need to have a conversation. I think, if it encourages more people to go to work, and everybody knows that since COVID, it's flexibility that is working for people far more than the money they earn. I mean, they obviously need to earn money, but it's that flexibility, that work-life balance, which leads to a healthier society. And actually, we've seen, there's a big survey out last week where a 4-day week has improved productivity around the clock. So all of those things are important. But again, it's sort of like whether you use a sledgehammer to crack a nut, or whether you get the sort of, the hostile employee who turns up and goes, right, I'm starting today. Actually, I'm going home now. I've been here half an hour. I'm going to be off sick for the next 6 months, and you've got to pay, which of course is nonsense, because there would still be the same rules and laws and stuff about dismissal and attendance and what have you.
Yeah, I remain a working from home skeptic. I think there's the danger of a huge divide opening up between people who've basically got cushy office jobs and can stay at home and even put on these devices, which I believe will fake the fact that you're doing things on your computer when in fact you're not. And ambulance drivers and construction workers and people who've got to go out in the filthy weather and do their jobs and provide the services that we all need. And furthermore, the spark of being in the office around the water cooler, having a chat, and sparking ideas, and especially for younger people, getting used to the world of work and addressing people properly and so on. I think it's a big debate, but I do take on board the quality of life thing. And especially if we don't get elderly care right and so on, some people are really stretched trying to match their work responsibilities with looking after elderly people.
I think you're right, Jim, and I think, as you say, for younger people, particularly those who started or entered work during or straight after COVID, many of them have never actually worked in an office. And so that ability to communicate, where you just pop over to somebody and say, can you help me with this? Or could you have a look at this? Everything is now either on Zoom or text or email. And so that ability to communicate and read body language and go, oh, hang on, there's so-and-so, I just need to go and have a word with them. All of that has gone, and it needs reshaping. And there is some evidence to suggest that the perfect solution, of course, is the hybrid solution. With that would be the sort of the Liberal Democrat way, wouldn't it, of half and half, but where you spend some time in the office, but you don't have this ridiculous presenteeism where you've got to be there at 9 o'clock, you've got to be there at 5 o'clock. And I do think the thing about people's entitlement to switch off, I mean, it's different for people like us because we're freelance, but I think if you are constantly hounded by the office and you're expected to respond at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening or 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and that's not a reasonable pressure for people in ordinary jobs at an ordinary level. It's different if you're
Frank emails me all hours of the day and night.
Yeah, but that's because he's lonely.
He will have the right to reply in due course to this.
Oh no, he won't.
This naughtiness that we're engaged in. There are a lot of other things in the budget. I mean, the Office of Budget Responsibility is going to have to sign off every formal budget statement. That's a shot across the bows of Liz Truss, of course, who refused to do that with her mini budget in September 2022. But just to revert to a previous thing, I think it's going to be fascinating. I wonder, with the flexibility that Rachel has sort of shown over public sector pay, whether that's the beginning of an easement. Now that she's in office, she feels slightly more confident about easing her prudency, or do you think that could be fatal? Because if she's neither prudent nor if she doesn't stick rigidly to that, then it could undermine the government.
I think if you honour what has been recommended to the public sector workers, who were treated so appallingly badly by the previous government, as if clapping on your doorstep on a Thursday evening is going to help anybody pay the rent. It's just, it's insulting to people. And I think, if you do that, then you help, as we said earlier, it helps recruit and retain people in those vital public sector workforces. But it also then allows you, it builds a base where it's easier for you to then crack down on big earners, tax avoiders, dodgy water companies and people like that. You can begin to claw back. I mean, I think that there are a couple of really big elephants sitting in Rachel Reeves' room. And one is there's going to be the payout to the post office sub-postmasters. The other one is the contaminated blood scandal. And we've now seen the first draft report of the COVID inquiry, which is costing an absolute fortune and is not expected to conclude until 2027, I believe. Now, she can't stop, she can't do anything about that. But there is going to be, and there has already been call for setting up and looking at how we deal with a similar sort of pandemic, or indeed any other civil emergency. We saw it last week with the collapse of computer terminals and Microsoft and spyware and everything else. It brought absolute chaos to everything from GPs and chemists to trains and planes. So there are all of those sort of big things that need to be put in place. And there's the stuff about, whether you bring back the railways into public ownership, whether you do the same to water companies. All of that costs money. But there's still an awful lot the government can do, and it is doing, I think, already, just by its tone, in looking at progress and looking like it means business. And to a certain extent, she might break her fiscal rules on paying the public sector people what they've been recommended as a pay rise. But if you get those people behind you and the people around them behind you, people will be more patient about the bigger things.
Yes, and there are some other issues that are being taken up, I think with cross-party consent on things like smoking, like a duty of candour, which was so desperately lacking in everything related to the Hillsborough disaster, to arena security following the dreadful events at the Manchester Arena in 2017 that increased demands on local authorities and people putting on events to be resilient against terrorist attacks. So I think all those things are really good. So a hefty King's speech, and we'll now turn to the Conservative Party. Now, as I understand it, they had a 5-hour meeting of the 1922 committee last week, which is the committee that regulates how they're going to choose their new leader. And the big issue is, do they go for a summer campaign and get it over with and then have the new leader in place for the television cameras at the October conference in Birmingham, or do they go longer, have the Conservative conference as a deliberative body, a bit like in 2005 when David Davis and David Cameron paraded themselves before the activists, and then they voted in November. And of course, a lot of this depends on what Rishi Sunak's prepared to do. People generally don't really want to see him standing down at the end of July as leader, then having to have an interim leader, someone like Duncan Smith or someone, and then a leader. That it would be better if Rishi Sunak was prepared to do the difficult job, because he's obviously battered and demoralised by leading the party to such a colossal defeat. So it's not easy to stand up at Prime Minister's questions and things like that, although I thought his demeanour since the election has been rather graceful, actually, and there's indications that he might be prepared to see this process through. What's your reading of where the Tories are now?
I think the Tories are where they were before July the 5th. They're in a mess and they don't know how to get out of it. I agree with you, though. I think Rishi Sunak has been very dignified and very graceful. And I think, that you could see that when he and Keir Starmer walked into the King's Speech in the Lords last week, that I think there is a warmth there. I suspect that underneath Rishi Sunak, although he is battered and bruised, as you say, I think he's probably secretly relieved. And until the Tories decide what they want to be, is Suella Braverman going to join Reform? I still think she will, although obviously it's hard to pin down the leader of Reform because he's obviously far too busy going to America. And who knows whether he's even been to Clacton, except to celebrate his election victory. I think if the Tories are sensible, but that's a big if, they would just bide their time for a little bit and continue having these conversations and work out where they want to be, because they've either got to go further to the right, in which case, they might as well just become Reform, or they go back to being the sort of centrist One Nation Tory party that was successful and gave them so much success over generations. I think their conference, as you said last week, Jim, is going to be a very dismal affair. You don't really want people sort of jumping on your grave, but they're so divided and they're so bitter. Okay, is it going to be Priti Patel? Is it going to be Kemi Badnoch? Is it going to be Robert Jenrick? Who knows? And frankly, at the moment, who cares? What they'd be better to do is to just bide their time. If Rishi Sunak stays on for the time being, at least until the new year, then they've got more chance of taking on the government, working out who sits on any committees, not that they're going to have as many seats as they used to have, and making a presence in the Commons and elsewhere. They've still got constituencies to look after and constituents to look after. But they must be mightily peed off that Keir Starmer not only won astounding election victory, he then did NATO and then he did Blenheim Palace, all with the huge and very tacit blessing of the King, which I think is very significant.
Yeah, it is, it's not much point in going over it again, but the decision by Rishi Sunak to call an election in July just before that and not have the opportunity in the high summer of those international gatherings that you allude to, plus of course the D-Day debacle. So he had 3 or 4 moments on the world stage which were all compromised by his decision to go to the country then, and a lot of stuff is coming out now. Apparently the Conservatives had not selected candidates in 200 seats, so the Conservative organisation was considerably inconvenienced by the decision to go at that particular time. When you just said as a sort of sidebar there, perhaps he was getting fed up with it. Well, they've paid a heavy price for his lack of stamina, if you want to put it like that, to go to the autumn and try and do slightly less badly. But that's something for the historians now, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Jo. I think we've covered the ground for today. I think we're back again next week. I think Frank's on a prolonged holiday, and perhaps
he could just listen in from wherever he is. We can just carry on wittering like this.
Or we may link up from this Greek island.
I don't think it's appropriate for people to appear working from the beach in their oiled sun trunks, swing trunks.
Well, we wish Frank a happy holiday, and if you're going on holiday from a business anywhere in the country where downtown is, you deserve a break as well. But we'll be back next week, and perhaps Jo, you'll be leading the discussion next week.
Well, we'll see. Who knows what's going to happen? A week's a long time in politics, Jim.
Yes, indeed. Well, cheerio from Jo Phillips and myself, and see you next week.